By the third week, the distinction between Nate Greaves and the alien world began to blur. He couldn't tell where his body ended and the planet's influence began. The nodules on his skin had grown into grotesque, pulsating sacs, their surfaces translucent enough to reveal the twitching tendrils within. His movements were no longer his own, jerky, spasmodic, as if his limbs were responding to invisible strings. The realization hit him one morning when he awoke to find a patch of his arm entirely alien. The skin there was no longer human. It was smooth, faintly iridescent, with faintly glowing veins that pulsed in sync with the rhythm of the planet beneath his feet. His fingers trembled as he touched it, the sensation unnervingly foreign. It wasn't just his skin. His sense of touch itself was wrong. Dull in some areas, hypersensitive in others. The hunger had transformed too. It wasn't a physical gnawing anymore. It was deeper, a yearning that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of his bones. Food didn't satisfy it. The gelatinous creatures he once hunted now disgusted him, their flesh leaving a rancid aftertaste that lingered for hours. But worse than the hunger was the clarity it brought. The first time he noticed the connection, it was subtle. He was standing near the crystalline forest, staring at one of the spindly trees, when he realized he could feel its hum, not just hear it, but feel it resonating inside his chest, vibrating through the altered veins beneath his skin. It was as though the tree was alive, communicating in a language he couldn't fully understand. When the stalker appeared again that evening, Nate didn't run. He'd seen it too many times now to be afraid in the way he once was. Instead, he stood frozen as the creature emerged from the shadows. Its body was long and sinuous, its membranous surface rippling in the faint moonlight. The limbs, impossibly long and delicate, moved with an unnatural precision, as though it wasn't walking but puppeteering its own movements. The stalker stopped a few feet from him, tilting its body in that jerky, insect-like motion. Nate realized it wasn't staring at him. It was staring into him. For a moment, he felt a jolt of recognition. Not of the creature itself, but of something deeper, something primal. The stalker raised one of its limbs, pointing directly at his chest. Then it let out a low, guttural sound, like metal grinding against stone, before disappearing back into the forest. Nate couldn't sleep that night. The planet was alive in a way he hadn't understood before, and it was changing him, reshaping him into something that fit. He spent the next day scavenging through the wreckage of the Icarus Dawn, searching for anything that might give him answers. He found it in the medical scanner. The device was damaged but functional enough to run basic diagnostics. With trembling hands, he placed the probe against his forearm and waited. The results made his blood run cold. His DNA was no longer fully human. The scanner displayed a swirling mix of data, fragments of alien code interwoven with his genetic sequence. The report showed foreign proteins, unidentifiable cellular structures, and mutations spreading like wildfire. His body wasn't fighting the changes, it was integrating them. He tried to focus, but the scanner's screen began to blur as his vision distorted again, colors bleeding and shifting unnaturally. He dropped the device in frustration. The whispers started that evening. He heard them in the hum of the crystalline trees, in the vibrations of the ground, even in the air. They weren't words exactly, but impressions, emotions, fragments of thought. They wormed their way into his mind, filling the empty spaces with alien ideas that weren't his own. And then came the memories. They weren't his memories. They couldn't be. He saw flashes of creatures like the Stalker, hundreds of them, moving through a landscape that seemed both familiar and alien. He saw their bodies breaking down, reforming, merging with the ground, the trees, the gelatinous pools. He felt their pain, their fear, their acceptance. It wasn't death, it was transformation. In one horrifying vision, he saw the surface of the planet ripple like water, countless forms rising and sinking into its depths. The planet wasn't just alive, it was conscious. It was a predator, and he was its prey. But it didn't consume in the way animals did. It absorbed, rewrote, repurposed. It didn't kill its victims, it turned them into part of itself. The Stalker wasn't hunting him. It was watching, waiting for him to complete the process. Determined to stop whatever was happening to him, Nate tried to cut one of the nodules from his arm. The pain was excruciating, but he pressed on, using a jagged piece of metal to slice through the fleshy growth. Thick, translucent fluid oozed from the wound, and the nodule wriggled as if alive. He hurled it to the ground and crushed it under his boot, but his victory was short-lived. The wound began to seal itself almost immediately, the skin knitting together with unnatural speed. Within minutes, a new nodule had formed in its place, larger and more vibrant than before. His body was no longer his own. That night, he confronted the Stalker. Armed with his makeshift spear and burning with desperation, he followed the creature into the crystalline forest. It didn't flee this time. Instead, it led him deeper into the trees, to a clearing where the ground pulsed with a bright bioluminescent glow. In the center of the clearing was a pool of liquid, its surface perfectly still despite the vibrations all around. The Stalker stood on the opposite side of the pool, its limbs twitching. Nate raised his spear, ready to strike, but the creature didn't move. Instead, it pointed to the pool. Nate hesitated, his breath ragged. The whispers in his head grew louder, urging him forward. The pool shimmered, reflecting his distorted face back at him. For the first time, he truly saw what he was becoming. His eyes slit-like and glowing, his skin stretched thin over alien veins, his body a grotesque amalgamation of human and something far worse. He stumbled back, clutching his head as the whispers became deafening. The Stalker stepped closer, its limbs trembling. Nate realized it wasn't attacking, it was guiding him, pleading. And then he understood. This wasn't about survival. This was about submission. Nate stood at the edge of the glowing pool, his body trembling, though not from fear or exhaustion. The tendrils beneath his skin twitched and writhed, pulsing with the same rhythm as the bioluminescent ground beneath his feet. He no longer felt entirely himself. His thoughts were fragmented, interspersed with alien impressions, emotions, images, and sensations that weren't his. The whispers in his mind had grown louder, clearer, their meaning just barely out of reach. The Stalker stood across the pool, its membranous body shimmering faintly in the light. It didn't move, but Nate felt its presence like a physical weight, pressing against his chest. Its limbs twitched erratically, as if beckoning him, urging him forward. The hum of the crystalline trees rose to a fever pitch, vibrating deep in his bones. He wanted to run, but where could he go? The first time he tried to step back, his legs refused to obey. He looked down and saw his feet sinking slightly into the gelatinous ground, the semi-translucent surface rippling as if alive. Panic surged through him, and he tried to lift his foot, but the planet held him fast. No, not the planet. His body, the tendrils inside him twitched violently, synchronizing with the pulsing light of the pool. He could feel it now, something deep within the ground calling to him, pulling at the parts of him that were no longer human. His chest heaved, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the changes in his body accelerated. The nodules on his skin began to split open, one by one, revealing writhing, translucent appendages that extended and coiled like parasites freed from a cocoon. He fell to his knees, clutching his head. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were voices now, dozens, hundreds, all speaking at once. He didn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. Let go, surrender, become. I'm still human, Nate growled through gritted teeth, his voice strained and unrecognizable. I'm still, me. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. His reflection in the pool told him otherwise. His eyes had fully transformed, the irises now elongated and slitted, glowing faintly in the darkness. His jawline had shifted, the bone structure sharper, more angular. His hands were no longer entirely his own. His fingers had elongated, the flesh translucent, the bones beneath faintly visible and pulsing with alien light. He fell forward, his reflection rippling in the pool as he fought against the changes. His body writhed and convulsed, the alien biology within him asserting itself with brutal efficiency. His skin stretched and tore in places, only to reform, the wounds sealing with a smooth, almost seamless perfection. He screamed, the sound echoing through the forest, but the hum of the trees drowned him out. The stalker moved closer, its limbs twitching in anticipation. It was no longer a predator. It was a guide. As Nate's vision blurred, he felt something shift deep within him, a final barrier breaking down. The memories that weren't his own came flooding back with terrifying clarity. He saw the world as the stalker saw it, as the planet itself saw it. He understood now. The planet wasn't just alive, it was ancient, patient, and infinitely cruel. It had existed for millennia, drawing life to its surface like a spider, weaving an irresistible web. It wasn't a predator in the traditional sense. It didn't devour its victims. It consumed them by rewriting them, turning them into extensions of itself. The stalker wasn't a singular creature. It was one of many, a fragment of the planet's will, just as Nate was becoming. He saw flashes of others who had come before him, humanoid forms twisted and reshaped, their individuality stripped away until they became nothing more than hollow vessels, living extensions of the planet's consciousness. He saw their faces, their despair, and then their surrender, and he felt their relief. For the first time, Nate stopped struggling. He sat on his knees at the edge of the pool, staring into its glowing depths. The voices in his head had softened, their once insistent demands now gentle, almost comforting. He felt the pull of the planet, the connection to something vast and unknowable. He was no longer afraid. When the stalker reached out one of its limbs, Nate didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his own arm, now elongated, his fingers tipped with faintly glowing appendages, and touched the creature's flesh. The contact sent a shock wave through him, a surge of energy that obliterated the last remnants of his resistance. He felt his mind unraveling, his human thoughts dissolving like sand in water. But in their place came something else, something greater. The transformation was complete. Nate rose to his feet, his movements fluid and alien. The stalker stepped back, lowering its limbs in what Nate now understood as deference. He was no longer a man, no longer prey. He was part of the planet now, his body and mind fused with its endless, shifting consciousness. The hum of the trees was no longer an oppressive noise. It was a symphony, a language he could finally understand. The whispers in his mind were no longer invasive. They were voices, companions, fragments of a collective that stretched across the entire planet. For a moment he thought of Earth, of the Icarus dawn, of the life he'd left behind. But those thoughts were faint, distant, like memories from a dream he could barely recall. Nate turned away from the pool and walked into the crystalline forest. The stalker followed, but not as a guide, as an equal. Together they moved through the alien landscape, their forms blending seamlessly with the environment. As they disappeared into the horizon, the twin suns began to rise, casting their light over the wreckage of the Icarus dawn. The ship lay silent, forgotten, a relic of a man who no longer existed. Nate was gone. Only the planet remained, and it was waiting for the next visitor.